Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Well, Canada-U.S. relations are always important, but recently they've been critical to Canada's ability to move forward in these perilous times. We're pleased to have as our guest today Ambassador Bruce Heyman. He is the former U.S. Ambassador to Canada from 2014 to 2017. Bruce, it's a pleasure to have you on Boom and Bust.
Great to be back, Tony. How are you?
I'm doing very well, sir. You have characterized the Canada-U.S. relationship as, quote, under siege. I'd love to get a little bit more of a sense of what you see as the state of this Canada-U.S. relationship, and then we'll take it from there.
So to clarify for everyone watching, the U.S. has no more important relationship than our relationship with Canada. And I would venture to say, given my time in Canada, both during and after my ambassadorship, I think it's also true for Canada and Canadians that the U.S. relationship is critical. Today, under the Biden administration, with Ambassador Cohn, Ambassador Hillman, I think our relationship is in actually really good hands, and we are in a really good place. My concern is, given what we experienced during the Trump administration, and given the activities that are happening domestically in the United States, my concern is that if there is a authoritarian-like leader that emerges, whether it's Donald Trump or someone else in the future, I think that we saw during the Trump administration that there were attacks on Canada, there were attacks on steel and aluminum, there were attacks on, the border, and during the pandemic, we saw how things could be. And the mistake we could make is if we don't prepare for that going forward. And I never thought we'd ever have to prepare for that previously, but given what I see taking place in the United States, I will work my darndest to either reelect President Biden or another Democrat. I will do my best to continue to preserve and protect this relationship, and I will do my best as a private citizen to continue to hold on to democracy, which I value so much. But I am awake now, and everybody else should be awake as to the perils that could be in front of us, and to just not do anything about it would be reckless, I think, for all of us, both in the U.S. domestically and internationally.
I mean, it sounds like it certainly isn't business as usual, and you've critiqued the Canada-U.S. partnership in a sense, and you want a bigger and bolder relationship. So what do you mean by that?
So when Donald Trump got up one day and said, I want to get rid of NAFTA, he soon quickly realized it wasn't that easy. This was a treaty that was signed on by Congress and Parliament through multiple administrations in the past. It had very specific language and provisions that forced him to negotiate, renegotiate, and then present that back to Congress and then to Parliament, and of course, Mexico as well. And so that demonstrates that when we have something codified, that we have something that is passed by Congress and Parliament, that it's protected from a leader in either of our two countries that wants to quickly dismiss the relationship. There are things that the president can do by executive order. And when it's not codified, let's use COP for an example. The President Obama joined COP. President Trump got out of COP. President Biden gets back in COP. So are there aspects of our relationship that some future president can quickly dismiss? And what are those? And what are those things that we find so much that are very important that we can codify and pass in a treaty that protects the relationship? And we should at least have that conversation in a serious way. I've talked to a number of people, they say, that's a heavy lift. Boy, that's going to be very hard. Yeah, there are a lot of things that are hard out there right now. But if we, I've used this term before and I'll use it. It's easier to get fire insurance on your home when it's not on fire. Once it's on fire, you're not going to get fire insurance and you're going to spend all your time just working on putting out the fire. And so right now, no fire. But right now, we should have fire insurance.
These are the words of the former U.S. Ambassador to Canada. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with our guest, Bruce Heyman. Please stay with us. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Bruce Heyman. He's the former U.S. Ambassador to Canada. Bruce, a lot of what you've been talking about recently is really supply chain related as well. That's a lot of what the talk is worldwide, not just Canada, U.S. President Biden has talked about friendshoring. How should Canada be a party to these efforts by the U.S. and by the Biden government to friendshore and to get more resilient supply chains?
So what we learned during the pandemic and what we have also learned during the Ukraine war is that we are all interdependent around the world on so many products and services. And whether it's energy, whether it's food, or whether it's microchips. And we all realize now how dependent we are. And I think that it's going to be important in a world going forward, whether it's a war, whether it's a pandemic, or whether it's just some mishap that can happen in a manufacturing plant somewhere else in the world, that we need to make sure that we have protections. And that is a large part of what I think the language of Buy America, Build America, Do It. My belief is, and my message is, that we need to think about Canada and the US as a combination in that process and not solely the US. I believe when we build things together, do things together, we're better than doing it separately. And we have so much in terms of resources that we can help each other and grow together. Canada is our number one trading partner in the world. And there's a reason for that. It's not just because you're next door, but that helps a lot. It's the quality of what we can provide. It's the rule of law that we all operate under. It's how we treat our workers, how we pay them, how we take care of the environment, what we do together. And there are resources that we both need from each other. Last I saw, you're not growing oranges and up in Canada, and we can use energy and other commodities. And that's just one small example. But the fact of the matter is we trade so much together, nearly $2 billion a day across our shared border of merchandise and services trade. And hundreds of thousands of people cross that border. We need to protect that going forward. But that's a very easy supply chain, and it makes a lot of sense that we do things together.
So when you were speaking earlier about some sort of treaty relationship, would supply chain be part of that, or would that be a separate set of negotiations?
So there are aspects to supply chain that we should just lay on the table right now. Part of the pre-clearance agreement that we have is pre-clearance on goods, but we haven't implemented that. So it's within the agreement, but it's not been yet implemented. Why not do that? Number two, supply chain. What is the biggest issue in supply chain is what happens in that very thin line, that border. Now, we live in a post 9/11 world, and our border between our two countries changed a lot. But what I think we realized during a pandemic and otherwise, that border can both be an impediment, but also a benefit to both of our countries. I think we need to look at modernizing that border and do it in a way that we have easier travel between each other. And I think it's time for the US to at least contemplate and look at that we have two borders with two countries, and they're very different, and we have very different circumstances. But the US today has a one border policy. And I think that the US should be looking at the circumstances at each of the two borders, because what we face in the northern border versus what we're facing in the southern border are entirely different issues. And to have a common view and a common set of rules on both, I think is, while it applies to a lot of individual things, it doesn't necessarily apply to the two countries.
We've got about 45 seconds before the break, but do you see, is that a common thought amongst Americans that there are two different borders, or is it all lumped together as one border?
I think it's very common to everybody that we have two different borders and two different sets of circumstances. Very few Americans totally appreciate that we operate with the same laws on both. And so remember when we had COVID and all of a sudden the Canadians said, we're open, Americans come on up. But we were still closed to Canadians in the US. Why? Because our southern border was closed. Why? It's because of the way they treated COVID. But Canada treated COVID better than we did at that moment. And so, it made no sense. But it's the way the rules are based.
We're going to continue our discussion with Bruce Heyman. He is the former U.S. ambassador to Canada. Got a little break ahead of us. Please come back. We'll be right back. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Bruce Heyman. He is the former U.S. ambassador to Canada, 2014 to 2017. Bruce, again, just sort of drilling down a little bit on your ideas for better and more harmonious Canada-U.S. relationship. This treaty idea I find very interesting. It really has never been advanced that way before. Talk a little bit about the security, national security aspects of this. Would this be a security treaty as well, in your mind?
I think there are a lot of aspects that we can think about. I personally think the next evolution of security for our two countries is going to be in cyber and every aspect of how cyber is impacting either foreigners trying to have influence in our elections or cyber attacks that are taking place from very difficult parts of the world, and how do we jointly take care of that? I mean, given the complexity of our banking systems and how we are in very many ways interlocked together in that, how our airlines are interlocked together and flights and communication, all of the vulnerabilities that we face from a cyber basis, I think should be prioritized. But this is an important point. And the important point is that when you think about North America, there was a day that Canada was in the European division of the State Department. That was in the European division in the intelligence agencies. And then it was moved over to, they said, why would it be over there? It should be in North America. That's where we are. But the Western Hemisphere then is very different. Canada versus the rest of the Western Hemisphere looks very different. And I think it looks more similar to other parts of the world in the Pacific, even with Australia and much of Europe. And I think that we need to sit down as a country in the US and evaluate, where does Canada fit in this mix and what is going to be the best and most appropriate place. Canada's part of Five Eyes. Nothing in South America or Central America is not Five Eyes. Canada is NORAD. We protect North America together. Nobody south of the US border is in NORAD. Canada is in the G7. Nobody south of the US border is in the G7. And so we have NATO. Nobody south of the US border is in NATO. So we have all of these various components where there are similarities in other parts of the world than where we are south of the US border. And so while we have a trading agreement that links us together, and while we have the Three Amigos Summit that happens more regularly now than it did in the last administration, which didn't happen, but in all seriousness, I think Canada is in a very different and unique place and needs to be thought of in that way. And it's hard sometimes because, we're sitting there in the Western Hemisphere and there's so many challenges throughout the hemisphere that are not related to Canada at all.
Really interesting point, because part of what you're talking about is your understanding of Canada. You do understand Canada, being a former ambassador here. You also understand your homeland, the United States of America. This is more of a general question, but what do Canadians get right and what do they get wrong about the American political process? And I'm asking that question as someone who wants Canada to mean something to the U.S. political process, so we can be more harmonious on some of these issues.
So, as hard as this may be for anyone external to the United States to understand, it's hard for Americans to understand that the noise that takes place in our political system are the extremes on both of our parties. But the work that gets done, which is the sausage making of Congress, which is so hard to even contemplate, But that actually happens in the middle. And it's hard to believe, but there's been a lot done in the last year and a half. I mean, when we sit down and have an infrastructure bill and we have gun legislation and we have a new chips bill in which we're going to invest in an industrial park, all of those have been done on a bipartisan basis. And there's more still in the works that I think is very likely to develop over these next weeks. And so my point to Canadians are, if you shut the volume off of all of those news sources and just said, tell me about outcomes, what actually is taking place in America? What legislation, bills, how is America operating? And I would say under this administration and many administrations, and I'd say Trump is an aberration, but through many administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, that a lot gets done in the middle. And that's the craziness of our process. But you hear all the noise and yelling and screaming. I mean, we just had this whole fight over veterans and payments on veterans.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening? We end up passing that bill as well.
We're going to take another brief break. We'll be back with our guest after that. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust with my guest, Bruce Heyman. He is the former U.S. ambassador to Canada. Bruce, talking about Canada-U.S. relations. Sometimes you talked about all the noise on Capitol Hill, and but the actual work that gets done. Where should Canadian policymakers direct their attention? Is it the Capitol? Is it the White House? Is it the American public? Is it the governors? Maybe it's a combination of all those things. But how do we get into that process so we can have some harmonious agreements?
So I have a very specific piece of advice right now for Canada and Canadians as you think about these next few years going ahead. And that is, I would look very specifically at the relationship with U.S. governors, and I would look very specifically at corporations that you have a strong relationship with, and where U.S. corporations are investing on both sides of the border, and we're working together. And I would invest the relationship there. We have the USMCA, CUSMCA, all of the CUSMA, and we have that. It's 99% of all the trade that we do is tariff-free, and we've got a lot worked out. Sure, there are going to be things that we need to work on at the edges on the trade, and we'll leave that to the ambassadors and our two governments to do that. But if you want to cement the relationship, and I'm going to tell you what my fear is. When my fear is, I turn on and I see a guy like Tucker Carlson slamming the Canadians and the Canadian government, and Joe Rogan going on his podcast and making very extreme statements. Understand that these people may be part of the noise that will come in the next administration. So where do you want those relationships? You're going to need them on the local basis. And Canada has demonstrated an ability to develop those relationships with all of your consulates, with all of your premiers working together. And you did it in your negotiations under let's call it the new NAFTA agreement. And so I'd refocus my efforts regionally right now. And by the way, some number of those governors may be running for president here, whether it's 2 years or 6 years from now. In some time in the future, they all have strong political aspirations. And I think it would behoove of the Canadians to have strong relationships at that level, because any one of them could emerge going forward. Republicans and Democrats, both sides of the aisle, you got to do it.
I've got you on my program. I have to ask. I know where you stand on Democrats versus Republicans, but look, Joe Biden has had a couple of few wins in the last few weeks. Tell us what your take is on the upcoming midterms and in the future.
Midterms are always challenging for every president, regardless of party. Almost every president has lost a large number of seats during the midterms. And this was on its path to look similar to that, I would say just even a month or 2 months or 3 months ago. But some things have changed. And I think the turn on Roe v. Wade has changed significantly. You saw it in the vote in Kansas, and you saw it in many of these local contests. You're seeing an energized voter base, which doesn't normally happen in the midterms. Second, this gun violence is out of control. And these AR-15s, and I think people are getting awfully fed up, and there are going to be a turnout of people that will be really focused on that. If there is any reduction with regard to the price of gasoline at the pump and food as we get closer to election day, those other issues will rise. And I think that there may be some surprises at the upside. I think the Democrats have a really good chance at even adding seats in the Senate. And I think the House, it's going to be a challenge, but not a zero challenge. And it's worth fighting for and working for. But I think people need to see what's happening. And I think what's happened over the last few months is that this becomes now a race against Donald Trump between the January 6th hearings, between what he's doing and promoting certain candidates out there, Roe v. Wade, gun violence. It then becomes an election against Donald Trump, which is not where the Republicans actually want to be.
This has been very interesting. I really want to say thank you to you, Bruce Heyman, for coming on this program. Lots of great insights. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Interesting discussion there with Bruce Heyman. He is the former U.S. ambassador to Canada. Lots of great insights on Canada-U.S. Trade relationship, security relationship, and of course, we had to delve into U.S. politics with the U.S. Midterm elections coming up this fall. I'm glad you were a part of that. I think there's some really good insights there for you to consider. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.